Welcome to Scrapple TV.
The police are at it again in Jena, Louisiana, and this time they're out for revenge. Welcome to Collateral.
Hound dogs on my trail, school children sitting in jail, black cat cross my path. I think every day's gonna be my last.
3 years ago, a white district attorney in a town called Jena, Louisiana, drew national attention for charging a group of 6 black teenagers with attempted murder and other major felonies after a school fight. Tens of thousands of people descended on the town in September 2007 to protest the injustice, and ultimately, the DA was forced to back down. 5 of the boys whose trials had been put on hold due to the public outcry eventually pled no contest to misdemeanor battery charges. But as recent events in the town made clear, the town's white power holders haven't forgotten that embarrassment. And just a couple of months after the successful civil rights organizing effort in Jena, the town's new sheriff, Scott Franklin, began plotting revenge. In July of 2009, Sheriff Scott Franklin led a 5 a.m. raid against a supposed narcotics operation headed by Darren Brown, the owner of a barbershop in Jena. The raid was the culmination of an almost 2-year investigation that purported to uncover a huge drug ring in Jena. Franklin spoke to a gathering of 150 officers borrowed from 10 surrounding counties that morning, with media members present, and told them that, quote, "If you think this is a training exercise, or if you think these are good old boys from redneck country and we're just going to good old boy them into handcuffs, you're wrong. These people have nothing to lose. It's going to be like Baghdad out in this community at 5 a.m., unquote. Franklin then commenced a SWAT-style assault, complete with helicopters and high-tech weaponry, and broke down the doors of citizens sleeping in their houses, several with children inside. By the end of the day, 12 people had been arrested, and many homes and businesses had been busted up, and yet no contraband was found other than a small amount of marijuana for personal use at one of the houses. We interviewed reporter Jordan Flaherty of leftturn.org, who was one of the first reporters to write about the Jena 6 back in 2007, and asked him to summarize what he felt were the key elements of this story pointing to revenge.
It's so transparent, I think, as revenge perpetrated by the sheriff of LaSalle Parish and by the district attorney of LaSalle Parish for the civil rights organizing that Katrina Wallace and other Jena 6 families undertook. You know, the planning for this revenge began right after those historic protests in 2007. The Jena sheriff has said in interviews they started planning this in November of 2007.
Among the people rounded up was 29-year-old Katrina Wallace, the half-sister of Robert Bailey, who was one of the Jena 6. Wallace's house was broken into while her youngest child was sleeping in her bed, and the police pointed guns at her head and at her terrified children. She was one of the leaders of the effort to free the Jena 6.
And through all of this, despite clearly catching everyone by surprise, they find no drugs. Other than one house, they find a piece of a joint. You know, they find people's personal cash, but no vast stores of cash that would indicate that they've broken up some sort of ring.
Wallace, who was Robert Bailey's sister, right? She is Robert Bailey's sister, one of the Jena 6. She was held, despite there being nothing found in her house, she was held on over $100,000 cash bond. Is that what I saw reported?
Yeah, all the folks were held on cash bonds, meaning they could not, they could not get a bail bond for partial amounts. They could only, get the cash for the full amount.
Now, many will focus on the fact that 4 of the defendants in this raid eventually pled guilty as proof that the police had cause. But a guilty plea is not necessarily an admission of true guilt in a place where a defendant doesn't believe he or she can get a fair trial. The raid reminded Flaherty of an earlier miscarriage of justice in Tulia, Texas.
This is a story about a town that wanted to send a message to the black community.
Now, Tulia, Texas, you had this freelance officer comes in. He was a pathological liar. He was racist. He was, seemed to be on a vendetta against the black community of Tulia. And he made up these charges against what ended up being, I think, about a third of the adult black male population of Tulia. Now, many of those folks that were arrested pled guilty, despite the fact that it was found later that he had completely made up the evidence against all these people, that none of them had been doing anything. When eventually it comes down to, it's the word of these people that are charged against the police and against the confidential informant in front of an all-white jury. And I think people felt that they couldn't get a fair trial, and that their best hope was to plead guilty, and that if they didn't plead guilty, they'd go to trial, they'd get convicted, and they'd get 10 or 20 years more.
Keep in mind as well, there's an active drug trade in every town in America, particularly in places where people work long hours for little pay, and people of all backgrounds are involved in it. Selectively targeting the black population for a roundup, though, is the real news story here. Not that some poor and middle-class people in a small town may have been involved in some small-time drug activity. In the past, when white power in the South could be displayed in its more raw form, there was lynching. Today, the lynch mobs have been largely replaced by SWAT teams, but the motive, intimidation, remains the same. Now, we point out that this sort of selective law enforcement wouldn't be happening if the town's corrupt law enforcement officials had been removed after 2007. How will justice come to LaSalle Parish for a black community that can't get justice through the legal system?
I think it needs federal oversight. And, from people I've talked to that have more experience in looking at how that's looked in Pittsburgh and some other cities where there has been federal oversight, I think there's been mixed results. It hasn't always been positive, but I think it may be the best tool that we have available. And that's when I spoke to folks in Jena. Marcus Jones, who's the father of Michael Bell,
Sure.
said that that's part of what went wrong in this whole Jena 6 case, is that even though we as a movement were successful in freeing those 6 kids, it stopped there, and the power structure remained in place. The sheriff and district attorney and judge all remained in place.
Several of the defendants still have trials pending and need legal support. But because in this case the defendants are not children, and because in this case the prosecution may actually have some video evidence gathered from its use of a confidential informant, there will be far less of an outcry than with the case of the Jena 6. But make no mistake, this is about revenge. To our knowledge, no organization is taking the lead in helping the defendants thus far, but that might change if you contact local media outlets and alert them to this unfolding injustice. Thanks also goes out to organizations like the Texas-based Friends of Justice, which works to uphold due process for all Americans, and organizations like the Louisiana Justice Institute, which is devoted to fostering social justice campaigns across Louisiana for communities of color and for impoverished communities.
I keep the world from a door.